Good morning and welcome. We are wrapping up another week of daily video devotions through the book of 1 Samuel with 1 Samuel chapter 28 this morning. Now, for the longest time, we've been talking about this rivalry, this really one-sided rivalry between King Saul and David. And if you'll remember, this rivalry began because King Saul one time wasn't exactly faithful to God. He wasn't obedient to God. He didn't follow all of God's commands. So God rejected him as king over Israel, and in short order, God anointed David to be the next king. But as we've talked about for so long now, that didn't mean that King Saul ceased to be king over Israel in that moment. That just meant that God was no longer with King Saul, and that eventually a day would come when God would completely reject King Saul and David would become king. And we said that this rivalry, this jealousy developed in King Saul because he saw that God was no longer with him, but God was with David in everything that David did. And even the people of Israel recognized that David was an anointed one, that David was this person God was with in just everything that he did. And see, instead of addressing his problems, instead of owning up to his sins, and instead of trying to recognize how he could use David and put David in positions to serve the kingdom of Israel, Saul decided to be jealous. Saul decided to even try to end David's life. Well, if you've read along with us this morning in chapter 28, you'll know that Saul has finally recognized he can't outrun his problems anymore. He can't outrun this conflict that he has with King David. He finally realizes that God has told him his days are coming to their end, and he's really done nothing to try to make his wrongs right. And see, I think this chapter, as I've read it the last few days, reminded me that so often in life we face conflict, we make mistakes, we're humans, we're broken individuals. And it's challenging to do this, but when we make those mistakes, when we hurt someone else, when we do something that is wrong towards someone else, when we sin, we can either try to run away from it like King Saul, or we can own up to it. We can try to confront our brokenness, confront our sin. We can own up to the hurt we've caused, to the mistakes we've made. We can take accountability for those things. And if we are willing to own up to our mistakes and our sins, if we're willing to take accountability for the wrongs that we've done, God will forgive us. And see, I think what's so interesting about 1 Samuel is it's really a story about two different people. It's a story about King Saul on the one hand, who was really defined by his brokenness. It was really defined by his shortcomings and his flaws and his sins because he wasn't really willing to address them on the one hand. And then on the other hand, it's a story about King David, who is so faithful and who trusts in God in all things, who's patient and who's merciful and who's willing to put his hope in God. So see, that leaves one question for us this morning. Are we going to be more like King Saul? Are we going to try to run away from our problems? Are we going to try to ignore our shortcomings and our sins and hope they'll go away on their own? Or are we going to be more like King David? Are we going to be faithful to God? Are we going to place our trust in God? Are we going to be obedient to God? Are we going to find our hope and our life in God? So think about that for the next few days, and we'll see you next week on Tuesday for 1 Samuel chapter 29.